Hi again, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm, and here I am back again in my indoor propagation room. It's been about 2 weeks since I've set up, and I guess this does count as a bit of a follow-up video, but really what I'm here to discuss is to answer the age-old question: should you pull on your cuttings and have a look at the base of them, or should you be patient, should you be good, leave them alone and let the little roots develop? Well, I'm not that guy. I always check the base of my cuttings as they're rooting in every stage. I want to see if it's getting any callus across the base. I want to see if it's rooting. I also want to see if it's rotting. There's lots of different things I do as I take cuttings, all of my different techniques, and I want to see how they're working. And the closer I get to the time that I took the cutting and the closer to the conditions when I set it up, the better I'll be able to judge whether it worked or whether it didn't work. Now, of course, this has only been going for about 2 weeks. I don't expect any of them to have any major roots. Usually about 3 to 4 weeks is when I would start to expect to see rooting. Here I'm probably going to see some callusing. I might see some of them rotting. So that's what I'll be looking for. Now later on, if you're trying to check on the cuttings and you see that you start pulling on it, it tugs back a little bit. And if it's in that age range or that time range when it could have developed roots, that's when you don't pull too hard and you don't snap off those young roots. And usually what I'll do at that point is I'll wait a little bit longer and then I'll tip them out of the pot to see if I can see any roots developing across the base of the pot. So let's go have a look and see what's going on with the cuttings I did about 2 weeks ago or less. Just before I start tugging on cuttings, let me give you a little context. If you saw my previous video, you know I'm growing these in these humidity domes, these 3 here. I've taken out of the humidity domes. All of my cuttings were done in the last 2 weeks, these ones more recently, and this is kind of what you're hoping or expecting to see from brand new cuttings that have been placed under the humidity dome and grown this way. They are still relatively holding their leaves. You can see that there's no sign of blackness emerging from the base of the cuttings. So this is kind of what you're hoping they will do or look like for you in the first week or 2, is just that they're staying in the game. If your light was too intense, if your temperatures were too high, you might see them very quickly move over to leaf drop. You might see a lot of yellowing by this point, but it looks like the humidity domes are doing their job. And so let's see what it looks like in ones that are closer to the 2-week mark. I've placed those humidity domes back on. I just had them off to show you the cuttings. And the next one I want to show you is one that's been under the dome for more like 10 days, 9 or 10 days these have been under the dome. So this is what you're going to see on the cuttings that have been in a little bit longer. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see that you're starting to see a little bit of yellowing develop on the leaves. This variety is Topaz Jewel. It does vary quite a bit from variety to variety, but I just wanted to give you an update. This is sort of what you're expecting to see after the first, 9 or 10 days. And I'm just going to pull out a cutting here, and I do it gently, I really do. And what I'm starting to see on this one, and I'm going to see if I can focus in on the stem, and what you should see there is that there's just a little bit of callus developing here on the bottom end of the stem. It's actually developing in a slightly different place than I would expect. Normally I have callus right along the basal ring of the cutting, but these are developing a little higher up. It looks like where thorns have been rubbed off and we've got newly developing callus up in that area there. I wonder if that's due to the treatment from my new rooting hormone, that it's doing something a little different than I expected. Not unwelcome. I would take callus anywhere on the bottom end of a cutting I can get it, but that's kind of interesting to me, and it looks like these cuttings are developing. Next tray over, this is a variety called Altissimo, and I want to draw your attention right down here to where I see some additional callusing on the bottom end of this cutting. Once again, not right at the base of the cutting. I can pull the base out and see what it's doing there, but it looks to me like it's done very little at the base. But here I can see that it's callusing a little bit higher up. Now, generally, I don't score my cuttings. The scoring is a technique where you cut a slit in the skin at the bottom end of your cutting and see if that improves rooting. I may have to rethink that if this is the way that my cuttings are going to behave underneath the new rooting hormone. Now, the other thing I'll mention is to do with these yellow leaves. If the yellow leaves are sitting there and they're not rotting, that's not such a big deal, but typically they will fall off and rot. So it's a matter of going in and stripping off some of the yellow leaves as they develop. One more tray here. This is a variety called Roberta Bondar, and you're going to see once again, it's been in for over a week, so you will have some of that yellowing foliage at the front there. And let's just check and see if I can find one that's starting to show any callusing. Now, you notice that as I pull on this, what I'm expecting is I'm not expecting any pullback. I don't think that anything will have fully rooted within 2 weeks of going into the tray. So I don't have to be that careful, but as these start to develop roots, I do get more careful about that. And now I'm going to try to get you a close-up of the bottom of this cutting because I do see some callusing for sure. And all of this tissue you see across the base here, all of this light-colored, kind of undifferentiated tissue, that's callus that will soon be forming into roots. And on this one, it's happening exactly where I would expect to find it on most cuttings, which is along the basal ring where the cutting was taken, and the callus starts to form just between the center wood of the rose and the skin. Having shown you some that are doing relatively well, I also want to show you some that are not doing quite as well. This is a variety called Koningen van Denmark, which is an Alba rose. And it's the first time I've taken cuttings from it in any significant way. And the kind of cutting that I took was from the flowering side shoots, or the spurs. And I don't think it reacted well to that. That's my theory right now. I've seen that sometimes on the old garden roses. And I want you to draw your attention to how widespread and immediate this browning and yellowing of the foliage was. It's like the entire variety went directly into shock. And if I pull out this cutting here, and now I'm going to try to get the focus on that, and I hope you can see that it started to turn brown. Not just a little brown, but dark brown bark all the way from the base and moving upwards along the length of the cutting. That's a sign that this cutting is done. And at this point, I would call it. I would say this variety, not maybe the whole variety, but certainly this cutting needs to be thrown away. And now I will check the cuttings and the rest of the variety. And it's quite possible that this Koningen van Denmark would respond better to fresher cuttings of new growth from this year, vegetative growth, not from the flowering spurs. And so that's the next thing I'm going to try. I have a couple more to update you on, but before I go outside to show you ones that I've already moved out onto the greenhouse benches, I just wanted to cover a couple of things about my indoor grow propagation setup here. And you'll see on the tops of some of these bins that I've placed a piece of paper. And actually you can see the reason why if I focus in here and how much brighter that one in the middle looks like. It turns out that these lights, hung as high as I have even, are a bit bright for new cuttings. And I noticed some curling of leaves immediately after going under the lights. The one on the left here, the Vivo Sun light, can be dimmed down, which I did. But I still want it hung that high because I want to actually get the light off to all of the bins underneath it. But the one directly underneath it gets a little more light, and so just using a regular letter size sheet of paper on top seems to cut down on the negative effects of having these bins be so close to the light. The other thing I will mention is that early on, and truly, I do think it's an advantage to use bottom heat, but the temperatures in my basement room have skyrocketed due to some local high temperatures. And so I've turned it off for now because I was afraid it was going to start damaging the plants. It's about 75 to 80 degrees in here anyway, so if I get like a 15-degree gain from there, I'll be well outside of propagation temperatures. All right, I have a couple more to update you on. Ones that I placed under the bottom heat initially and then put out in the greenhouse, and they've started to develop some callusing as well. Here I am in the outdoor greenhouse, and out here everything is done by timed mist from overhead. So it's a little bit less of a controlled environment, but I get good results out here too. And I ran out of room indoors, so I moved a couple of varieties out here. They were doing well enough. They were on the heated bench or the heat mat, and so I saw some decent results there. Let me show you this one here. This is Variegata di Bologna, which I did early on, and if I show you the base of this one here, hope we can get a decent focus on that one. And there we go. You can see that there's a good, robust callus across the base of that cutting. And over here is another variety called My Gold that did really well out of the gate, right on that heated mat. And let me pull out one of those and see if I can focus on the callus on that one. And there I hope you can see that it's developed a nice bit of callus across the base of that cutting. So that should proceed to rooting very soon. Next time I come out here in the next week or so, I should pull on this and it will tug back, and then I'll know that I've got some roots on the way. Thank you so much for watching as I check the results for my first 2 weeks of cuttings here. I will probably be doing follow-up videos throughout the season just to show how the different techniques, especially that change in the rooting hormone, has affected my success rate and as they start to develop more substantial roots. So I hope you'll join me back for that. If you have any questions about propagation or any other rose growing questions, please drop those into the comments of the video. And once again, thanks for watching.